What did Edward Gibbon contribute?
Edward Gibbon, 1737 to 1794, wrote The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, which was published between 1776 and 1788. This tome is still read today. Gibbon argued that Rome fell because of invasions by barbarians and the corruption of Christianity that rendered the citizens of Rome servile and pusillanimous.
What are John Stuart Mill's progressive ideas in the subjection of women?
Mill begins the subjection of women, 1869, by saying that it is more difficult to argue against a position that is held on irrational grounds than one based on reasoning. René Descartes 1596 to 1650 made a similar claim at the beginning of his Meditations. Those who hold irrational views will not be persuaded to change them by rational argument but will just look for a more profound basis of their opinion, even to the point of claiming it is the result of instinct. This set the stage for Mill's claim that the condition of women at the time he wrote was the result of a long historical tradition of might makes right, combined with the power enjoyed by all men simply by being born male. He compared this condition to slavery on a number of counts. Women were completely dependent on men for their livelihood, being deprived of education and means for productive employment. Women did not have control over their own bodies or children in marriage. Women lacked civil rights, such as the right to vote or own property. And women were subject to violence and rape within marriage, without legal recourse. Mill also claimed that women were trained to display the traits of mind and character, or lack thereof, that would make them desirable subordinates to men. Stupidity, preoccupation with appearance, and adoration of and submission to men. Men assumed that all women wanted to be wives and mothers, which made their exclusion of them from education and the professions ironic, to say the least. But although marriage appeared to be a contractual relationship, women did not have any real freedom to withhold their consent because they could not earn a living on their own. Against existing arguments that women were not the equals of men, Mill claimed that insofar as women had been so suppressed by their circumstances in marriage and lack of education, men knew very little about what their true capabilities were. He claimed that the highest masculine and the highest feminine characters were clearly equal.
Why did Pierre Gassendi promote mitigated skepticism?
Pierre Gassendi, 1592 to 1655, and his colleagues placed a high value on the new science of the time, which included the heliocentric, sun-centered solar system theory after the Copernican revolution, the atomic theory holding that the activities of all matter were determined by its smallest particles or atoms, and a rejection of those parts of the Aristotelian views of science that were in disagreement with these views. Gassendi's use of skepticism to attack Aristotle, and his use of moderate skepticism to support the new science, therefore made perfect sense. It helped Gassendi's cause that he was well liked and highly regarded among his colleagues in the Catholic Church, as well as by some of the more extreme skeptics of his day. And that he was careful not to go against church doctrine. Indeed, while defending the new science on the one hand, and insisting that no scientific knowledge could be certain on the other, Gassendi was able to live and think in both the traditional Catholic world and the new scientific one.
Augustine's role at the beginning of medieval philosophy.
St. Augustine, Aurelius Augustinus, 354–430, was a pivotal figure in the transition between classical and medieval thought. Some see him as the last of the great classical thinkers, whereas others claim him as the first medieval thinker. He lived through the decline of the Roman Empire, with its political turmoil and military failures, and the Roman state's acceptance of Christianity as the official religion. Just before Augustine died, the Vandals were burning and sacking Hippo, where he was bishop. Augustine's most influential works are Confessions on the Trinity, on Genesis according to the letter, and City of God. They all reflect his own faith after conversion and provide an intellectual structure for much Christian writing that followed. Although Augustine's initial education was in rhetoric, his later studies in Neoplatonism deeply influenced his religious understanding. Still, he approached philosophy in terms of how it could serve religion, rather than as a valuable discipline in its own right. This secondary status of philosophy was widely accepted by philosophers throughout the medieval period. Augustine was one of the early church fathers and was canonized as a saint by popular acclaim, as was the custom during the early centuries of the Catholic Church.
What did Gorgias say about thought versus existence?
Gorgias of Leontini in Sicily, c. 485–380 BCE, taught the art of persuasion for success in politics. His surviving treatise of that which is not, or, on nature claims that nothing truly is. Although, even if anything were to exist, it could not be comprehended by man. And even if it could be comprehended, it could not be communicated. Just because we have a thought about something does not mean that thing exists. Thoughts do not entail the existence of what is thought. Or else humans could not think about, for instance, imaginary animals. Or in other words, not everything we think about exists or is real. Therefore, Gorgias concluded, if anything exists, it cannot be thought. The same gap between thoughts and things occurs between words and things and between the thoughts of different human beings.
What were some of John Stuart Mill's achievements?
Mill's father's interests and connections set the direction for his son. Although Mill ultimately chose his own path based on life experience and the influence of his wife. Mill's father, James, was a philosopher and economist, as well as an official in the East India Company. J.S. Mill also worked in that company until he retired when the British government took over the company's administration in India in 1857. Mill edited the Westminster Review in the 1830s and was a member of Parliament between 1865 and 1868. Overall, Mill was dedicated to getting the educated public of Great Britain to accept scientific solutions to political, social, and economic problems. Although he also placed great value on humanistic concerns as informed by the arts and life itself.
What is a scientific revolution according to Thomas Kuhn?
A scientific revolution, said Kuhn, 1922 to 1996, is preceded by a time of crisis in which the leading paradigm is no longer able to guide investigation and produce new discoveries in the field. A competing paradigm arises that is able to both explain the data accounted for in the old paradigm and explain new data. Eventually, the new paradigm wins, because its adherents get control of the field in question. Along with their victory comes the authority to rewrite the textbooks so that the entire history of the science can be viewed as leading up to the new paradigm. Most of the practitioners of the old paradigm do not change their minds, but literally leave the field, either through retirement or death. The new paradigm then establishes a new era of normal science that persists until the next revolution.
How did other philosophers and scientists react to Pierre Gassendi's views?
Jean de Sillon, 1600 to 1667, and René Descartes, 1596 to 1650. Tried to develop positive knowledge claims that would avoid Gassendi's skepticism. Sillon argued that knowledge was possible because it existed in logic and the sciences. Descartes based his entire philosophy on an attempt to demonstrate the existence of certain scientific knowledge that would not conflict with church doctrine. In the end, the Jesuits upheld Gassendi's view that certainty is impossible and condemned Descartes.
Once the idols are eliminated, what did this allow us to do, according to Bacon?
Once the mind was cleared of its idols, it would be able to discover causes through experimentation. Francis Bacon, 1561 to 1626, thought that all of nature was made up of bodies or material objects that acted according to fixed laws. These laws were the forms of material objects. In seeking causes, first we must look for those things from which certain other things always follow. For example, heat is followed by a motion of particles. Next, we look for the cases where the effects do not happen when the cause is absent. No heat, no movement of particles. When what we are studying occurs to a greater or lesser degree, we must be able to account for the variation. Whenever possible, we should invent instruments to measure what we are investigating. In this case, thermometers and barometers.
What is Daniel C. Dennett's philosophy of biology?
Dennett, 1942, engages evolutionary theory by asking the question, skyhooks or cranes? Skyhooks are unexplained leaps from one stage of development to the next, whereas cranes are ways of understanding a later stage based on the design of an earlier one. Dennett has argued that consciousness, the contents of consciousness, and even the products of consciousness, such as Shakespeare's plays, can be naturalistically understood in the same way that physical evolution is understandable. Neural systems create multiple drafts of the same thing so that the brain itself is a sort of dung heap in which the larvae of other people's ideas renew themselves. Dennett is also a proponent of the doctrine of memes, whereby certain patterns of behavior are products of evolution that are physically inherited. His extreme materialism has attracted many critics, as well as supporters.
What were the general ideas about women that were held by people in the 17th century?
The old Aristotelian idea that females were imperfect males was still assumed to be true in 17th century Europe. The modern science of biology, which established two distinct sexes, was still in the future. Although 18th and 19th century sexual distinctions based on biology supported the idea that the capabilities of women were inherently limited and inferior to those of men, they at least focused on the distinctness of male and female identities. The Aristotelian view has been called the one-sex theory. Many serious and well-regarded theorists of the human body solemnly insisted that the female reproductive system was no more than an inverted form of the male one. Like Aristotle, they believed that women were naturally colder and damper than men, besides being in every respect weaker. Moreover, women were considered to be the sex-desiring, aggressive gender, whereas men were often viewed as helpless and vulnerable in sexual matters. Medical opinion concurred that blood, semen, and spinal fluid were all the same basic vital substance or fluid, albeit in different forms. Sexual intercourse was not only often viewed as a weakening form of physical dissipation, but male ejaculation was believed to draw brain tissue down the spine and out the penis, a very strong reason for a male philosopher to remain celibate. Moreover, women were viewed as the source of venereal disease, unwanted children, and burdensome financial obligations. So great was their negative sexual power held to be that they were at the same time also presumed responsible for male impotence.
What was Edmund Husserl's phenomenological method?
Husserl thought the task of the philosopher was to perform an empirical reduction of intentional objects of consciousness by describing what is in the mind without making a commitment to the reality of the mental content. That is, Husserl thought that we should describe what appears to be so to us without making a commitment that it is so, e.g., my cat is sitting on my computer, but Husserl would prefer that I stick to my impressions or the representations in my mind of the cat sitting on the computer. This is a special perspective, distinctive from the natural attitudes of ordinary people and scientists who address actual things that exist in the world. For Husserl, there is no philosophical distinction between a content of consciousness that is a dream or a fantasy and one that corresponds to something happening in reality. There were, however, different types of reduction for Husserl. Most notably epoche, in which the truth and reality of the objects of consciousness are bracketed. This bracketing of truth or reality was exactly the same thing as not making a commitment to the truth or reality. Husserl would have wanted me to describe the cat on my computer and my perception of it, but to stop short of claiming that the cat really is sitting on my computer. Also influential was Husserl's eidetic reduction that had as its subjects acts of consciousness itself. An eidetic intuition that pertained to the essences of objects of consciousness. Thus, analysis of perception, which is something that consciousness does, would be an example of eidetic reduction. Whereas analysis of what is being perceived would be an example of eidetic intuition. This distinction was to prove very influential in Jean-Paul Sartre's philosophy, where he distinguished between consciousness as awareness and what we are conscious or aware of.
How have consequentialists responded to criticism?
Some consequentialists, such as philosophy professor and author Kai Nielsen, 1926, have simply bitten the bullet and asserted that whatever saves the most lives is good. Nielsen is famous for his 1972 article in Ethics, in defense of utilitarianism, which provides the example of a fat man wedged in a cave, the waters are rising and his companions are trapped behind him. Nielsen asserts that if the fat man were humanely dispatched by an exploding stick of dynamite conveniently on the scene, there is no violation of morality. Consequentialists have responded to the criticism of being unjust by claiming that rule consequentialism can allow for justice because a just rule will result in better consequences. And in the long run, unjust behavior will fail to improve people's lives. For example, in an immediate situation, a doctor might sacrifice a healthy patient so that 6 others who need organ transplants may live. But the rule followed in the sacrifice of the healthy patient would undermine confidence in doctors. And in the long term, more harm than good would result from killing the healthy patient. Others have pointed out the obvious problem of calculating consequences in the future. Another strong objection to consequentialism, voiced by Bernard Williams, 1919 to 2003, is that the focus on results with everyone counting the same undermines the integrity of an agent by ignoring the importance of personal projects to that agent. In a famous example, Williams imagines that a traveler is asked to kill 1 Indian to save 9 more from being shot. He argues that the consequentialist approach violates the importance to the traveler of his own moral identity as someone who does not kill others.
What was Immanuel Kant's notion of synthetic a priori knowledge?
Knowledge is synthetic or ampliative, according to Kant. If it is about objects that can be experienced in the world, it is a priori if it can be known without experience.
What are some important facts about Martin Heidegger's life?
Heidegger was born in 1889 in the Black Forest in Meßkirch, Germany, an area to which he maintained close ties throughout his life. He attended gymnasium, high school, in Freiburg, beginning in 1906, where he read Franz Brentano's 1837 to 1917, On the Manifold Meaning of Being according to Aristotle, 1862. He intended to become a Jesuit priest, but he was rejected. So he prepared for the Catholic priesthood at Ludwig University in Freiburg. He read the works of Edmund Husserl, 1859 to 1938, there and at the urging of his teachers, changed from theology to philosophy and mathematics. After marrying Elfriede Petri in March 1917, he joined the German army, advancing rapidly to corporal, although he was discharged for reasons of health. As Husserl's assistant and a colleague of Karl Jaspers, 1883 to 1969, Heidegger was successful in philosophy, becoming an associate professor at the University of Marburg, where he wrote Being and Time. 1927, in a matter of months to secure that post. After this work, he experienced the well-known care, or turn in thought, which led to his An Introduction to Metaphysics, 1953. Among his students were future philosopher Herbert Marcuse, 1898 to 1979, and political theorist and philosopher Hannah Arendt. 1906 to 1975, who became his lover before she had to leave Germany. As a Jewish intellectual, it became evident that she was in danger. After being questioned by the Gestapo, the German secret police. During this time, Heidegger was influenced by Lao Tzu's work on meditation, which led to his own understanding of being through language. Heidegger became rector of the University of Freiburg in 1933 and was a member of the National Socialist Party. In 1945, the French military government removed his professorship. Although he was able to gain emeritus status, provided he did not teach again. He had a nervous breakdown in 1946 but wrote his letter on humanism to make it clear that, regarding his study of being, his work was not as humanistic as Jean-Paul Sartre. 1905 to 1980, and other existentialists had mistakenly assumed. In 1950 his professorship was restored, and in 1951 he was allowed to be professor emeritus. To recap, he was first given emeritus or retired status without having been reinstated as a professor. Then he was reinstated as a professor and was given a normal emeritus status after that. He continued his work until he died in 1976.
What is Native American philosophy?
Native American tribes and nations have held well-developed worldviews, religions, epistemologies, metaphysics, and social and political views long before Europeans invaded and appropriated their lands. Much of this knowledge was transmitted orally and subject to loss and fragmentation. Following what many indigenous people call the Native American Holocaust, the development of Native American philosophy as a subfield in academic philosophy requires not just reconstruction of past knowledge but some acceptance of the methods of Western philosophy. The problem is that these methods are highly problematic for most indigenous thinkers. Furthermore, after centuries of distorted descriptions of their cultures by anthropologists and government officials, most Native American philosophers have a strong preference for speaking in their own voices, rather than agreeing to let others present their perspectives. There are not very many Native Americans in U.S. university philosophy departments at this time, perhaps fewer than 50. Nevertheless, since the 1980s a canon of Native American philosophy has developed, which includes the following sources: The Sacred Hoop by Paula Gunn Allen, 1986, How It Is, The Native American Philosophy of V. F. Cordova by Linda Hogan, by Kathleen Dean Moore, Kurt Peters, and Ted Hahoba, 2007, Cultural Sites of Critical Insight, Philosophy, Aesthetics, and African American and Native American Women's Writings, by Angela L. Cotton and Krista Davis, 2007, American Indian Thought, Philosophical Essays, by N. Waters, 2003. And Defending Mother Earth, Native American Perspectives on Environmental Justice, by Jace Weaver, 1996.
What was Herbert Spencer like as a person?
Spencer was a sickly child and received homeschooling from his father and his uncle. A strict dissenting Protestant clergyman. Once, at a social event, someone asked the uncle why his nephew wasn't dancing. "No, Spencer ever dances," he answered. Mary Ann Evans. The novelist, better known by her pen name, George Eliot, had a warm friendship with Spencer. Although he did not enjoy public places and entertainment, he took her to restaurants and the opera. Biographers believe that Eliot would have married Spencer, if he'd asked her, but he never did. She said that the life of this philosopher, like that of the great Immanuel Kant, offers little material for the narrator. After First Principles of a New System of Philosophy, 1880, was published, Spencer developed an illness that led to insomnia and self-medication with opium. He became very reclusive and would sometimes wear ear plugs so that he did not have to listen to what others said. Although he advocated for public causes such as the metric system and against the Boer War, he spent his last years with very little human interaction.
What are some other interesting facts about A. J. Ayer's life and career?
Ayer was a prominent subject of academic gossip for his womanizing. He was married 4 times, and for his engagement in fashionable popular culture. There was an overall glamour to his life. Ayer's mother's family founded the French Citroën car company, and his father worked for the wealthy Rothschild family of bankers. He attended Eton, won a scholarship to Oxford, and served in the SO. Special Operations Executive, during World War II. Before the war, while on a visit to New York, Ayer made a record with actress Lauren Bacall. He supported the Tottenham Hotspur Football Club and was known to its fans as the Prof. Ayer was also a secular humanist. He was honorary associate of the Rationalist Press Association after 1947, and a successor to evolutionary biologist and humanist Julian Huxley when he became president of the British Humanist Association. In 1965, Ayer was named the first president of the Agnostics Adoption Society. He edited the anthology The Humanist Outlook in 1965. At the peak of his career, Ayer served as a sort of in-house atheist for the British Broadcasting Corporation. He debated the Jesuit philosopher Frederick Copleston, 1907 to 1994, on the subject of religion. Copleston was the author of the 9-volume History of Philosophy, 1946 to 1975, so the two were matched in erudition. Ayer, apparently briefly, revised his lifelong atheism after a near death experience in 1989 brought on by choking on a piece of smoked salmon. Toward the end of his life, though, he said, "What I should have said is that my experiences have weakened. Not my belief that there is no life after death, but my inflexible attitude towards that belief."
What was new in metaphysics and epistemology after logical positivism?
Metaphysics and epistemology made a new empirical start that was thoroughly informed by science. P. F. Strawson, 1919–2006, defended a common-sense metaphysics, and, like Wilfrid Sellars, 1912–1989, he developed the idea of a common perspective that was opposed to science. Strawson did much to reclaim for philosophy a common-sense approach to the world, which the logical positivists would have thought was meaningless, because it was not about science. Nelson Goodman, 1906–1998, resurrected the perennial problem of induction reasoning that begins with experience and builds toward knowledge. W. V. O'Quine, 1908–2000. Uniquely redirected the course of 20th-century philosophy by combining pragmatist insights with a rigorous philosophical method. Also, perhaps partly as a result of Quine's work, Hilary Putnam, 1926. Reinterpreted pragmatist epistemology by applying its insights to questions of truth in the sciences.
Why was the idea of a manifest image important?
Whose analytic 20th-century philosophers who explicated a manifest image of the world sought to reconcile the common view of the world with the scientific view. The term was coined by Wilfrid Sellars, 1912–1989.
Who is Noam Chomsky?
Avram Noam Chomsky, 1928, is an American philosopher of linguistics and one of the most widely influential critics of contemporary politics over the 20th century and beyond. Now a professor emeritus of linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Chomsky is recognized as an important founder of cognitive science in linguistics, psychology, and philosophy of mind, as well as computer science. His major publications that are relevant to philosophy of language and mind include Syntactic Structures, 1957, Cartesian Linguistics, 1966, Current Issues in Linguistic Theory, 1964. Aspects of the Theory of Syntax, 1965, The Sound Pattern of English, with Morris Hall, 1968, Language and Mind. 1968, Studies on Semantics in Generative Grammar, 1972, The Logical Structure of Linguistic Theory. 1975, Reflections on Language, 1975, Essays on Form and Interpretation, 1977. Rules and Representations, 1980, Language and the Study of Mind, 1982, Modular Approaches to the Study of the Mind. 1984, Knowledge of Language, Its Nature, Origin, and Use, 1986. Barriers Linguistic Inquiry Monograph 13, 1986, Language and Thought, 1993, The Minimalist Program. 1998, On Language, 1998, and New Horizons in the Study of Language and Mind, 2000.
Who was Alan Matheson Turing?
Alan Matheson Turing, 1912 to 1954. Was a British cryptologist and mathematician who is credited with founding modern computer science. His Turing machine, which was an extensive thought experiment, formalized the concepts of algorithms and computation. The Turing machine consists of a possibly infinite paper tape with a stream of binary symbols that is continually scanned by a read-write device moving left or right and erasing or writing symbols on the tape, according to a program. Turing showed that any such machine could be programmed to simulate any other one, meaning that it was a universal machine. This universal machine could implement every known mathematical method. He extended this model to machines that cannot be simulated by a universal Turing machine, called Oracle machines. Turing proposed that intellectual activity can be understood as networks of universal and non-universal machines that can learn, through training, to become something like universal machines. After the invention of actual electronic computers, Turing suggested that theories of artificial intelligence could be tested. If there were a computer that could perform the same calculations as a human being to the point where a human being could not tell whether the results were produced by the computer or by another human being, then there could theoretically exist artificial intelligence. Turing's 1950 article in Mind, Can Machines Think?, continues to be highly influential in philosophy of mind discussions. In part as a result of John Searle's, 1932, treatment of it.
How did Isaiah Berlin oppose Marxist historicism?
Berlin did not think that impersonal or absolute forces could determine history. Apart from the free will of exceptional individuals.
What is the Brights movement?
The Brights movement is committed to promoting public understanding and acknowledgement of the naturalistic worldview. Chicago biology teacher Paul Geisert and Manga Futrell. An educator who is also a board of directors member of the American Humanist Association and a former president of Atheists and Other Freethinkers. Founded it in 2003. Futrell defined a bright as an individual whose worldview is naturalistic, free from supernatural and mystical elements. The Bright's movement motto is illuminating and elevating the naturalistic worldview. The organization has three major aims: promote public awareness of the naturalistic worldview, achieve recognition that individuals who hold this worldview can behave in principled ways in important civic matters, and educate all members of society to recognize and accept the participation of Brights.
What is Catherine MacKinnon's contribution to second-wave feminist political philosophy?
In the 1970s, Catherine MacKinnon, 1946, began to argue that sexual harassment is a form of sexual discrimination, outlawed by the 1964 Civil Rights Act. MacKinnon and Andrea Dworkin also developed legal theory to outlaw pornography. The U.S. Supreme Court ruled against sexual harassment in 1986, largely based on MacKinnon's work. And the Supreme Court of Canada has partly accepted her arguments against pornography. MacKinnon's books include, In Harm's Way, The Pornography Civil Rights Hearings. Edited and introduced with Andrea Dworkin, 1997, Toward a Feminist Theory of the State, 1989. Pornography and Civil Rights, A New Day for Women's Equality, with Andrea Dworkin, 1988. Organizing Against Pornography, 1988, Feminism Unmodified, Discourses on Life and Law, 1987. And Sexual Harassment of Working Women, A Case of Sex Discrimination, with Thomas I. Emerson, 1979.
What was John Searle's Chinese room argument?
In his The Rediscovery of the Mind, 1992. Searle supposed that a person who understands no Chinese is locked in a room with Chinese symbols and an algorithm or computer program that can be used to automatically answer questions in Chinese. The answers are good enough to be indistinguishable from answers by a Chinese speaker. Searle insists that what is missing from this picture, which is the overall computational theory of the mind in contemporary philosophy, is understanding the person in the room does not understand Chinese. Adherents to a computational theory of mind, in response to Searle's position, would probably claim that unless we go back to a mysterious ghost in the machine, the behavior of the person locked in the room is exactly what is meant by understanding Chinese. As to who is right in this argument, no one knows for sure. As Jerry Fodor, 1935, noted, we, meaning philosophers of mind, do not yet have an adequate theory of mind. If you think you do, then try explaining exactly how your desire to raise your right arm results in that arm going up.
How did Iamblichus practice Neoplatonism?
Iamblichus of Syria, c. 245 to 325, was a student of Porphyry's. 233 to 309, who set up his own school in Apamea, in what is modern Syria. Porphyry had practiced theurgy or magic based on vegetarianism and other physical restrictions. But he thought the effectiveness of theurgy was limited to lower levels of spiritual ascent. Iamblichus developed a more elaborate system of theurgy for every stage of salvation, which was similar to Christian sacramental theology and became an integral part of Neoplatonism from then on. Iamblichus also embellished Plotinus' system, dividing the one into two. One responsible for the creation and the other transcending it. The Roman Emperor Julian, c. 331 to 363, became interested in Iamblichus' system. After Iamblichus incorporated many of the Greek gods into Plotinian descriptions of creation and salvation.
Who was A. J. Eyre?
Sir Alfred Jules, Freddie, Eyre, 1910 to 1989, was the British logical positivist who became famous for his language. Truth and Logic, 1936, which was followed by The Problem of Knowledge, 1956. Eyre's main contribution was to relate logical positivism to traditional philosophy, which in no uncertain terms resulted in a devastating attack on metaphysics, ethics, and religion. The attack was on the meaning of terms used in these fields and resulted in the claim that they were meaningless. Eyre was the Grote Professor of the Philosophy of Mind and Logic at the University College London from 1946 until 1959. And after that the Wickham Professor of Logic at the University of Oxford. From 1951 to 1952 he was president of the prestigious Aristotelian Society. In 1973 he became a Knight in the Legion of Honor. Eyre's publications include Philosophical Essays, 1954, The Concept of a Person and Other Essays. 1956, The Origins of Pragmatism, 1958, Metaphysics and Common Sense, 1969. Russell and Moore, The Analytical Heritage, 1971, Probability and Evidence, 1972, Bertrand Russell. 1972, The Central Questions of Philosophy, 1973, Hume, 1980, Philosophy in the 20th Century. 1982, Freedom and Morality and Other Essays, 1984, Ludwig Wittgenstein, 1986, Part of My Life. 1977, and More of My Life, 1984, as well as numerous articles on related topics.
How did William Harvey discover the closed circulatory system?
William Harvey, c. 1578 or 1579 to 1657, was educated at Cambridge and studied at Padua. where Copernicus, 1473 to 1543, had also studied. His father-in-law was a prominent London physician, and Harvey became a doctor at St. Bartholomew's Hospital and a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians. Ibn al-Nafi, 1213 to 1288, and Michael Servetus, 1511 to 1553, had described pulmonary circulation earlier. But Servetus' work was lost by the time Harvey had begun his research. Hieronymus Fabricius, who taught Harvey at the University of Padua, had discovered valves in veins, but Harvey was not satisfied with his explanation, and sought a more encompassing theory of how blood moved in the body. In his 1628 Exercitation Anatomica de motus cordis et sanguinis in animalibus, an anatomical exercise on the motion of the heart and blood in animals, Harvey claimed that the heart pumped blood throughout the body in a closed system. Galen had believed that venous blood came from the liver and arterial blood from the heart, each of which sent blood to the different parts of the body where it was consumed. Harvey recorded his observations during vivisections, dissections of live animals, quantifying the amount of blood that passed through the heart and counting the beats of the heart. He estimated the amount of blood pumped in a day, depending on the size of the heart. He postulated two circulatory loops, one to the lungs and the other to the vital organs, and he correctly described the role of the valves of the veins in returning blood to the heart. Harvey was personal physician to both James I and Charles I. That gave him the opportunity to vivisect deer from the royal parks for his experiments and demonstrations. He was also able to observe a pumping human heart in the hole of the chest of a viscount's son, whose wound had been covered with a metal plate. Harvey was not able to observe capillaries and could not account for the transfer of blood from arteries to veins.
What were Descartes' main ideas and passions of the soul?
René Descartes claimed that his mind or soul feels passions, or sensations and pains, in the body. The soul is therefore connected to all parts of body, although there is one part of the brain, namely the pineal gland, where it exercises its functions more particularly than elsewhere. That is, the soul directly affects the body through the pineal gland by setting animal spirits in motion, via the will. Descartes thought that the will was infinite because it was a copy of God's will, but that human understanding is limited, because the will often outstrips the understanding. All manner of human evils and misfortunes follow. Consciousness, or the representation in the mind of the sensation and pains in the body, was unique to human beings, according to Descartes. He thought that animals lacked both a pineal gland and consciousness, and were therefore mere machines.
How was Simone de Beauvoir influential as a feminist?
Writing at a time when women did not have a recognized voice in public life, they had only received the right to vote in 1944 in France or opportunities to pursue professions. Beauvoir offered a comprehensive account and analysis of the position of women in Western society with a focus on their life stages. For women, unlike men, biology is destiny, she said. She was not particularly sympathetic to the subordinate condition of women. Generally, because she thought that they too easily accepted their secondary passive roles in comparison to the leading active roles allowed and expected of men. Beauvoir did not clearly indicate ways in which women could realize their human freedoms and transcend their object-like status, or immanence, as human beings who were not only objectified by men, but who seemed too content to objectify themselves. However, she began a trend in social and political activism, as well as intellectual life, which recognized and addressed the ways in which women were the second sex.
What were George Simmel's thoughts on fashion and money?
Simmel distinguished between individuals' personal selves and social selves, the latter being necessary for functioning in complex societies. Both fashion and money had symbolic uses in this sense. Simmel believed that fashion was limited to life in cities, because, as he wrote, it intensifies a multiplicity of social relations, increases the rate of social mobility and permits individuals from lower strata to become conscious of the styles and fashions of upper classes. His view of money was similar in that he felt it can operate as an impersonal form of exchange, as well as having value. Through money, subordination and domination can be expressed, while at the same time money permits more freedom within society. Simmel was also aware of the disadvantages of the use of money in its ability to create special hardships and crises in social identity.
What is Epicureanism?
Unlike its namesake today, which connotes an enjoyment of good food and fine wine, ancient Epicureanism was an austere doctrine. It was founded by Epicurus, 341 to 271 BCE, and his colleagues Metrodorus of Lampsacus, 331 to 277 BCE, Hermarchus, dates unknown, and Polyaenus, dates unknown. Epicurus set up communities at Mytilene, Lampsacus, and on the outskirts of Athens, where his school was known as the Garden. Epicurean practice required detachment from political life, although not opposition to it, and time spent in philosophical discussion with friends. Epicurus wrote letters on physics, astronomy, and ethics, as well as maxims, and a major work, on nature, little of which has survived. He was an atomist, as Democritus, c. 460 to 371 BCE, had developed the theory. Except that he thought atoms themselves contained sets of minima, parts of atoms that cannot be further divided. According to Epicurus, the atoms are in constant motion, with swerves and collisions that have resulted in the formation of bodies as we experience them. There is nothing godlike outside of life and society as we know them. And the gods should just be viewed as ideal models for our own behavior. Death is not to be feared, because we will merely dissolve into our constituent atoms, which are incapable of feeling pain or anything else. Epicurean ethics held that pleasure is our only good, it is better even than virtue. Pain is the only evil. Pleasure should be sought in stable ways, which makes a simple life necessary. We should satisfy only our most necessary desires in the company of friends like us. The highest pleasures are katastomatic, or those related to satisfaction. The kinetic pleasures that result from stimulation merely increase our insecurity. They are like desires. Our ultimate goal should therefore be the absence of pain via a simple life for the body and the study of physics for the soul. This will result in ataraxia, or freedom from disturbance.
How did Pyrrhonic skepticism affect early modern natural philosophy?
If there could be no certain knowledge about the world, this left the uncertainty of sense knowledge as the only knowledge available about the world. Modern natural philosophy, or modern science, was based on the principle that sense knowledge is the foundation of all our knowledge about the world.
How did Derrida explain deconstructionism in his Of Grammatology?
Derrida's Of Grammatology, 1972, is about the instability of texts. Due to the fact that all writing depends on the meanings readers bring to it, which may change, so that it cannot be claimed that a given piece of writing has a specific and stable meaning. All signs depend on other signs for their meanings. So there is never an ultimate meaning. Meaning is always deferred. Jacques Derrida, 1930–2004, speaks of archie writing in this regard, which refers to gaps in the meaning of what is sacrosanct. All writing is split between its intention and how a reader understands it. And there is a gap between the writer and the reader. Derrida's description of the reality of writing is meant to be an accurate account of the nature of intellectual life. The imagined presence of a being before whom the intentions and meaning of the philosopher is grasped, is the illusion under which philosophers and others have labored for so long. Derrida thought that there was an ambiguity in the spoken word, which made the written word necessary. And he introduced the term difference to write about this difference. If one says difference and difference aloud, there is no audible difference between them. The relevant difference can only be expressed in writing. although we have already seen how meanings are inconclusive in writing. It is this insight about the dynamic nature of meaning against Ferdinand de Saussure's 1857 to 1913 structuralist view that there is a system of meaning constituted by speech, for which the written word is somewhat secondary, if not unnecessary, that earned Derrida the label post-structuralist. Beginning in 1968, Derrida criticized the structuralist tradition as moving from center to center in futility.
What is behaviorism?
Propounded by psychologists Ivan Pavlov, 1859 to 1936, and John Broadus, J. B. Watson, 1878 to 1958, and streamlined by Burhus Frederick, B.F. Skinner, 1904 to 1990. Behaviorism was the thesis that introspection had no use for a science of mind. Behavior is modified by its consequences in ways that can be described without any recourse to the mind in terms of intentions, beliefs, or prior knowledge. Human psychology was no more than behavior that could be observed in the laboratory. Without considering that behavior from the point of view of the subject who was behaving. Learning is conditioning, a series of automatic responses to repetitive rewards and punishment. Watson propounded the theory of behaviorism in his book Behaviorism, 1925. Noam Chomsky's, 1929, review of Skinner's 1959 classic tome Verbal Behavior is taken to have demolished Skinner's behaviorist theory of language learning, and behaviorism more generally. This is important to philosophy in two ways. First, it restores the importance of how things seem or are experienced by a human subject. Second, it allows for speculation and analysis of how what is going on in the subject's mind is organized and processed in the brain.
How did John Stuart Mill criticize William Whewell's view of moral intuitionism?
Mill's criticism of Whewell's moral intuitionism was that it implied that morality could not progress because necessary truths are always true. Mill further claimed that Whewell's necessary moral truths would preserve the status quo. And he charged Whewell with conservatively supporting slavery, marriage without women's consent, and cruelty to animals. What Mill missed, however, was that, as with fundamental ideas in science, Whewell held that we may not know all of the relevant rules of morality. Thus, discovering these rules allowed for moral progress.
What was Bertrand Russell's theory of definite descriptions?
Russell gave an account of how it is possible to talk meaningfully about things that do not exist. According to his theory of definite descriptions, what a proposition of the form X is Q means is there is exactly one thing that is X and that one thing is Q. Or, at least one thing is X and no more than one thing is X and whatever is X is Q. Russell's theory makes it possible to distinguish between the contradiction of X is Q and X is not Q. To use Russell's example, A, the King of France is bald has as its contradictory, A. There is no King of France, or there is more than one King of France, or there is one King of France who is not bald. But, B, the King of France is not bald means, according to Russell's theory, B, there is one King of France, no more and no less, and he is not bald. And, A and B do not have the same meaning.
What was the influence of logical atomism?
As a philosophical doctrine, logical atomism was surpassed by logical positivism. However, its main rhetorical force did demolish what Bertrand Russell, 1872–1970, termed logical holism, or the notion that the world is a whole, no part of which can be known independently of all others. Logical holism was the epistemological doctrine associated with absolute idealism.
What was Reichenbach's theory of logical empiricism?
Reichenbach disagreed with the logical atomists and logical positivists, who felt that objects of scientific study could be described as if they were made up of sense data. His own realist view became known as physicalism. He argued on pragmatic grounds for a probabilistic interpretation of induction, so that induction could be expressed in terms of probabilities of future events based on the occurrence of these events in the past. Reichenbach also developed a triple-valued logic in which statements could be true, false, or indeterminate, for quantum theory. He added the option of indeterminate to true and false. Quantum theory specifies that some events could not be determined even though their causes were known. So it was important to add indeterminacy to a system of formal logical notation. Although much of his work is highly technical, his The Rise of Scientific Philosophy, 1951, is a clear and somewhat generalist account of his perspective.
What is Mysterianism?
Mysterianism is the view that it is impossible for us to explain consciousness. This perspective, sometimes held by philosophers, is now called the New Mysterianism, and is based on the writings of Colin McGinn, 1950, such as The Problem of Consciousness. 1991, The Mysterious Flame, 1999, and Consciousness and Its Objects, 2004. The name New Mysterians was bestowed by Owen Flanagan, 1949, in his Science of the Mind. 1991, and it was based on the rock group and the Mysterians. Past philosophers such as Gottfried Leibniz, 1646–1716. similarly believed that the emergence of consciousness could not be fully understood by conscious beings. What is striking about the new Mysterianism, though, is that it cropped up after almost a century of rigorous philosophical attempts to provide theories of consciousness and cognition. It is different from claiming, as Jerry Fodor, 1935, does, that we do not now know how the mind is connected to the body, because it claims that we can't ever know that, or even what the mind itself is. Some aspects of this thought are reminiscent of skepticism. In the ancient world and in the 16th century,